Welcome back to the Client Builder Playbook. I'm Brian Quaranta, and of course, I'm here with the master and the legend, Larry Lewis. Good to see you again, my friend.
Good to see you, Brian.
You know,
Good to be with you.
I'm always going to call you that because of how much you changed my life and the course of our business. And
I
and
appreciate
and,
that.
and look, I mean, the truth is, you've changed so many advisors' lives. I can't tell you. I mean, there's not an event that I attend that I don't run into an advisor that says, "Hey, Brian," and I go, "How does this guy know me?" They go, "Oh, I've been watching you for the past 6 weeks on the in the academy," and we start getting into conversation, and they just talk about how much this has changed their practice. And I've told you for the longest time. I mean, the Client Builder book that you wrote, which is an incredible book, should be on the New York Times bestseller list, which it is still my goal to get it there someday. But today we're going to talk about that the fortune is in the follow up.
Right.
But before I do that, I was thinking about our last conversation that we had about storytelling.
hmm
And I was just wondering, can you ever over tell stories? Can you over story
Yeah,
tell?
you can. It's interesting because you know those old-fashioned hourglasses. Like I think there was Days of Our Lives, which is an old
You mean the
soap
ones that
opera.
turn over with the sand?
Yeah, I think that was like the symbol at the start of Days of Our Lives when our mothers used to watch that on TV. Um, if you think of that old-fashioned hourglass and you think of those grains of sand going through the hourglass, I think of those grains of sand when you're interacting with a prospective client as their attention span. And the longer you have that
Mm,
turned upside down and the sand that's going through the hourglass is basically their attention span. And let's face it, in
yeah,
today's world, attention spans are shrinking,
that's
right?
right.
And so when you're telling a story, you want to make sure that the story you're telling resonates with them by virtue of the fact that the characters in that story are just like they are.
Yes.
So they really get the feeling like you're telling their story as opposed to somebody else's story, right?
Hmm.
But most importantly, keep your eye on their body language, the eye contact. You know, if you tell a story that goes on too long,
You can see the body language.
yeah, you can
Yeah.
see it and you'll
Yeah.
lose them. And so one of the ways that you can gain time by, essentially turning the hourglass on its end is to take your story, stop for a moment, pause, and say, can you relate to that?
Right.
Do you share any of those concerns? And get them talking again. And by getting them to talk again, it restores their attention span. And then you can, you know, um, do an offshoot of that story or go deeper. The other thing I have to comment on, because I see this a lot, I really do. Um, One of the good questions that we ask in the diagnosis step is once we've brought out two or three common concerns and we've drilled down on those concerns to ignite the fire and get it to grow from a little campfire of a problem into a bonfire of pain.
Hmm.
And the bigger the problem becomes, the greater the sense of urgency. One of the things that I see people make a mistake of, and it goes back to something you mentioned in our last session, where we're always trying to build rapport with a prospect. And there's a danger in building rapport that we take their story and we make it about us.
Mm.
I'll give you an example. Back in the day, as you well know, when I was in my 20s, I was an avid whitewater kayaker.
Hmm.
Now, I happened to work as a guide for a couple of the rafting companies that were, a couple hours outside of Pittsburgh. And so Monday morning would roll around and we'd be standing by the water cooler talking about what we did that weekend. And somebody there would talk about the fact that they went whitewater rafting for the first time and how excited they were, what an
Hmm.
awesome experience it was. And, in an effort to connect with them, I would say, "Oh, it's so cool that you went. I love whitewater rafting. In fact, I was a guide down on the Cheat River."
Yes.
Or, I got so into it, then I went out and bought a whitewater kayak, and now all of a sudden I'm upstaging them.
Yes. Right.
And, their story pales in comparison to my story, and they actually feel diminished.
Yes.
And what I realized
Mm.
is that, you know, it's not about me at
Right.
that time.
Yes.
It's about them. And especially when we're dealing with a prospective client, it should never be about us. It should always be about them. And so I've seen advisors do this where somebody would say something to the effect of, we get to that question after two or three pain points have been discussed. We say, so let's suppose we can alleviate those concerns. Let's suppose you can live out the retirement of your dreams. Tell me what you would like that retirement to look like. Do you have any intention to travel? And somebody will say, we've always wanted to go to Alaska. And that's one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to take an Alaskan cruise. And I was listening to a recording of a of one of my clients one time. He's a big hunter,
Yeah.
and he had hunted and fished in Alaska.
Yeah.
And in the interest of building rapport,
I knew you were going to say this.
once he heard this individual talk about how they've always wanted to go
Yeah.
to Alaska, he took over the story. He says, "Oh, I've been to Alaska
Yeah.
4 times.
Yes.
I went on a grizzly bear hunt on Kodiak Island.
Yeah.
Oh, we went backpacking on these glaciers outside of the village of Talkeetna."
Yeah.
And for the next, I'm not kidding you, 20 minutes,
He tells the story
he tells his
that has
story
nothing to do with their situation.
that has nothing to do
Yeah.
with their situation, that made their idea of going on a cruise look like they were just a bunch of wimps.
Right. Yeah.
When this guy is out,
Yeah.
walking in the tundra
Yeah.
with his like,
You just asked me a question of what I would want to do and where I'd want to travel. I said Alaska, and now you go into a whole personal story about your Alaskan trip. What's this got to do with you helping me today?
exactly.
Yeah, that's what they're thinking.
That's what they're
Now,
thinking. And
the
they will
problem,
actually react that way.
they react that way internally, but people also will engage with you and act interested when you're telling that story.
Because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yes.
They have better people skills
Yeah.
than the advisor does in that
Yeah,
situation.
but if you're sitting at a lunch table with a bunch of people, right? Maybe a couple buddies and some new people that you've never met before, and people are going, right? We see this a lot when we go to, these events, right? We take a break, big lunch, there's new people there that you haven't seen. And these, there's stories going around. That's okay when you're sitting around having lunch with your
Right.
peers and stuff. But I think that that's a natural way for people to communicate,
Right.
right? In those environments,
Yes.
but not in the conference room.
Yes.
I had to learn actually because I was taught the wrong way for so long because it was all about building rapport. I had to learn when I learned the client builder process, when they would say something to me and a story would come up in my mind, I would have to remind myself, it doesn't matter, Brian. Your story doesn't matter. Don't even engage with it.
Yeah.
And I've done a really good job with that. But in the beginning, that was hard for me to do because I wanted to engage like this client you're talking about.
Right.
And so that's an example of over storytelling because,
Over storytelling.
yeah,
And the reality is that, and this requires some maturity for us to understand, but the best analogy I can give is in the dating context.
yeah,
Um, ask a woman if she would rather have a guy ask her questions and be interested in her, as opposed to him telling stories of all these wonderful things that he's done, either in his career or in his social life. And they'll all tell you, no, the guy that they fall in love with is the guy that asks questions about them,
yeah.
makes them feel important. But yet,
You're so true. Because I think that the saying is, if you want to be interesting, be interested. Right.
exactly.
So I can remember at the time that I started working with you, I was going through my divorce. And you had armed me with these strategies, and I started to use them in my everyday life, which you encourage,
Yeah,
right? Practice on your everyday life. Put
absolutely.
yourself,
These are just good, solid communication
yes,
skills.
yes. And I would meet, women out for a date, and I would spend the entire time asking them questions. And I wouldn't know anything about them. We'd leave that date and they go, "This was the most amazing date ever. I mean, you are just an incredible person. But I really don't know much about you."
Yeah,
But they had such a great time, and it really is so true that people love to talk about themselves.
yeah.
They want to talk about themselves.
I have to tell you, and I'm not. This is a story that involves my former wife, and I'm not trying to disparage her by telling the story, but it
Right.
really illustrates this. We had a new couple that had moved into our neighborhood, and their next door neighbor had a welcome party.
Yep.
And we went to this welcome party, and it was very typical. It seemed like the guys were all centered in the family room watching the game, the girls were all in the kitchen. And we came home from this event, and my wife says to me, "Did you get a chance to talk to Lily?" Lily was her name. I said, "No, I talked to her husband for a good bit. Seems like a pretty good guy." He says, "Oh my God, Lily is wonderful. We are going to be such good friends." And I'm like, "Wow, tell me about Lily. You know, where did she come from? What did she do um, in her career outside of the house? What hobbies does she have?" And my wife couldn't answer any of those questions.
Interesting.
And I says, "Huh." And it dawned on me later that night that the reason that she thought that she and Lily were going to become such great friends is that
Yeah.
Lily asked her a lot of questions.
Yes.
Lily made her the center of attention
Right.
and got her to talk. And by virtue of that, you know, my wife fell in love with Lily. And that's how it works.
Yes.
There's an
So
old,
powerful.
it
It's
really is. So the minute you start, now, if you sense that what you're saying is boring, it probably is.
yeah.
Yeah. um, there's an old story that my dad once told me that I thought illustrates this really well. There were two salespeople riding in a car together.
Yeah.
And this one salesperson's going on and on. The guy at the wheel, he's driving, he's going on and on about himself and his family and,
Mhm.
a lot of braggadocio in there, how wonderful
Mhm.
he is. Finally, he goes, "Okay, that's enough about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me?" The point is, it's natural, and
Right.
um, with my current wife, my last wife, we talk about this all the time. How you go places and people just want to talk about
Yes, they
themselves.
do. Yes, they do.
They don't really want to know anything about you, and it's a flaw.
Yep.
It's a problem. I think it goes to the point that people you know, are lonely. They don't get the chance
Yeah.
to talk.
Right.
Even couples, oftentimes talk at each other. They don't take the time to really delve in and listen. And so people have this need. I think it was the ah, I'm going to forget his name now, but it's the father of American psychology. Always said the greatest need of the human beings are to feel.
Maslow or Carl Jung or
Uh,
Jung?
Good question.
Yeah.
No, it'll come to me.
Okay.
But he said the greatest need is the need to feel appreciated.
Wow.
How do people come to feel appreciated?
Yeah.
By being listened to.
Yeah.
And, we're pretty good in terms of doing it with our kids. You know, we want to hear about them and their day and what makes you think that, sweetie? And,
Mhm.
we do that, but it seems like with our partners or with our friends, we tend to be talking more about ourselves.
Surfacey stuff too. I mean, look at one of the most popular things that we've seen pop up lately is these table talk cards. Have you seen
Yes,
these?
yes.
Where you having family dinner, you having family over for dinner, and now you can pull out a card and talk. I mean, something as simple as we were using them the other night, and it was like asking my dad, "What's your favorite color?" And now I've known my dad for 49 years. I never knew what his favorite color was.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because at Christmas time this year, I gave both my sons and their partners this book called, I think it's called A Journal of Us or something like that. So
Yeah.
every day they're supposed to pose a question to one another.
Oh, wow.
And
That's brilliant.
so we started it on Christmas Eve. The night
Yeah.
that we all received it. And the question was, if you could do anything with your partner, if you could spend the perfect day with your partner, what would you spend the day doing? Okay.
Wow.
And it was interesting because we all had different responses. Now, my gut,
So the book is asking the question,
the book is asking the
and each
question,
partner is answering it.
and each partner is supposed to be answering this with one another. And there's one of those deep questions every day, just like the table talk
Yes.
cards. But the whole idea is let's get to know each other
Right. On a deeper level.
on a deeper level.
Right.
And I guarantee you, though, that the last time anybody in that room posed the question to one another was Christmas Eve. So, I was thinking about it because last night Kelly and I were saying we should let's do another question. So we
Yeah.
did, and but it's good stuff, and it really helps you to understand, and people feel valued when you want to know that. Now, if we
Because I think about how, one of the things that always stressed me out was cocktail hours.
yes,
I hated them.
yes,
Um, the client builder process made those cocktail hours a little bit easier because I knew that if I just walked over to a table and put my glass down and started asking somebody questions,
yeah,
uh, that's all I needed to do. And they became less stressful
yeah,
because I realized that my job there was just to go in and ask people questions about themselves.
just be
Forget,
curious.
just be curious.
Now, that's one of the things that, I've known you now for over a decade, and that's one of the things I think you bring naturally
Yeah.
is that, we all have different modes, okay? We all have, kind of, and you and I have the similar personality profile. We're DI,
Yeah.
the I craves being the center of attention. We love
Mm-hmm.
that. But we're both mature enough to know that that's not where the magic happens. The magic happens when we take the spotlight off ourselves, put it on the other person,
That's right.
and especially in a client, in a prospective client, a sales context, because at the end of the day, talking about yourself doesn't do you any good. Learning about them does two things. A, it helps you qualify that
Yes.
prospect, okay? But B, it makes them feel appreciated. It makes them feel like you really understand them. And as a consequence of understanding them, you'll be able to tailor the retirement plan that you build specifically to them.
Mm-hmm.
And, um, a mutual friend of ours, Billy Voiles, um, who his whole team has gone through the training process, he says he knows when he's got the client, when the client says to him at the end of the call, he says, wow, this was a great meeting. This was very different than meetings we've had in the past. And he'll say, how so? He said, you really seem to understand us. You really asked a lot of good questions. You weren't salesy at all.
Right.
And that's the secret. And I think back to one of the very first financial advisors that I went to, and his first step in the process was basically a goal setting workshop,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which was good. Now, we incorporate a good bit of that into the diagnosis step of our sales
Softly.
process.
Softly.
Softly,
Yeah.
because we want to know what are your goals and
Right.
objectives for
Yeah.
retirement. Um, but the thing that I found so interesting is that my wife at the time did not want to go to that meeting because she didn't want to be bothered by talking about finances. That's not her strong suit.
Right.
She relied on me to handle most of that, and I get it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often heard advisors ask me, um, this happened in one of our workshops just the other day. The question came up at the end of the call. He said, I've got somebody where I've met with the husband twice, okay? And I've told him that we will not have another meeting unless his wife attends.
Absolutely.
I mean, in my opinion, I think
Yeah.
the wife needs to be there right from the get-go.
Agreed. That's what we want to try to do.
But he said, but she says she hates finances. She's not interested. I says, that first appointment shouldn't be any discussion around finances.
Correct.
You may gather a little bit of information by, you know, accepting the worksheet that they filled out with their financial data on it, or maybe they provide you with their statements.
Yeah.
But that initial meeting should be all about the concerns and challenges that they're wrestling with when it
That's right.
comes to retirement, their goals and objectives for retirement. None of that's financial related.
Correct.
Money in and of itself doesn't have any emotionality.
Correct.
What you do with that money does. And, you know, so I said to this young advisor, I said, first of all, I wouldn't have let it go to a second meeting without her being there.
Mm-hmm.
But in the third meeting, basically you have to let her husband know that you're going to have to start over
Yeah.
because you're going to want to get
Great
her
point.
perspective on the pain. You're going to have to the diagnosis step with her, the investment sacrifice step with her, the decision process step with her. She's got to be the center of attention on all that stuff. And you're not going to be sharing anything about their finances or what you would recommend, the stuff that would normally bore her. But you know what? If she can't get engaged in terms of talking about her life and the fears and concerns she has related to her life and the goals and objectives she has related to her life, well, then you're not going to get a prospect. You're not going to get a client out of that.
And you gave me one of the best questions ever to ask when you open up a meeting like that, because that will happen every once in a while.
Yeah.
You know, where you do get just the husband that comes in and sits down. But when that spouse finally comes in,
Mm-hmm.
you know, obviously position in the know is important. You got to do that at the beginning of every single meeting. But you had shared with me what you want to do is find out how much Bob has told Nancy.
Yes.
And you posed it like this. Uh, Nancy, as you know, Bob and I have met a number of times, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad to finally meet you. I'm just curious, how much has Bob shared with you about everything that we've been talking about? And if you could just share with me maybe the, you know, one or two things that you really like that Bob shared with you that brought you back in here today with him.
Yeah.
And that was, you said you can't open it up without finding out what she knows
That's right.
because things get lost in translation.
They sure do.
What are the chances of Bob actually explaining everything to Nancy the right way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one of the questions I would ask, so what are the questions that you have that Bob hasn't brought up?
Wow. That, yeah.
Because everybody's different. And we see this all the time with couples. There tends to be one couple who's more
Yeah. All the time.
sophisticated
Yes.
financially,
Correct.
and that person tends to dominate the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
At some point in time, we have to say, Bob, we've heard from you, and we appreciate your perspective. I want to get Nancy's take on this. So if you wouldn't mind,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll start to ask Nancy a question, and Bob will answer for her.
Yeah.
And that's where to say, Bob, I get it.
Yes. Yes.
But
very important there.
let's hear what Nancy has to say, and I want to hear Nancy's words. And Bob's got to be quiet for a while, and let Nancy talk. And I'll never forget this goal setting workshop that I did with this advisor. I learned things, and I'd been married 7 years at this point.
Yep.
I learned things in that meeting that I didn't know about her. I said, really? That's one of your goals.
And that's why Client Builder is known for causing emotional tears and sometimes even marital fights because
Sometimes it does.
it does and because we're digging deep.
Mm-hmm.
And for the first time they're having a discussion about money they've never had before.
Right.
And they had no idea that this person felt this way about it.
Yeah.
And or Nancy's saying, well, you know, I was hoping that Bob would retire this year. And Bob goes, really? You wanted me to retire this year? I didn't know that. I thought you wanted me to work for another 5 years.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable, but that's what good questions will do.
Yeah.
I want to move on to the fortune is in the follow-up.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. And let's talk about how you would define the fortune is in the follow-up.
Well, so a lot of times we'll have a prospective client come to you and they don't become a client. And what I see happen more often than not, especially with young advisors that are new to using the client builder selling process, they think they have found pain when they really haven't.
Yeah.
Okay. They have found a problem, but they haven't spent enough time understanding the ramifications or the implications of that problem to turn that problem into pain.
Mm-hmm.
And my definition of pain is a personal, compelling, emotional reason for your prospect to take action. And the action we're looking for is to either change their strategy from an accumulation strategy to a retirement spending strategy,
That's right.
and ideally change the advisor they're working with from their current advisor to you, or if they're a do it yourselfer, from doing it on their own to working with you. And what I oftentimes see happen is young advisors don't go deep enough.
Mm-hmm.
They hear a description of the problem and they think, I found it, I found pain.
Yep.
And, so their diagnosis step takes all of like 6.5 minutes. And so when I demonstrate what the diagnosis step should look like, I'll spend 6.5 minutes on one problem.
Yeah. Yes.
And I'll ask questions, but tell me more about that. How long has it been a concern? What strategies have you considered?
Yeah.
Have they worked?
Right.
Um, if left unchecked, what's your fear as to how this problem could manifest
Yeah.
10 years, 15 years into your retirement?
Right.
How do you feel about that? And of course, they're talking, they're doing the majority of the talking. My questions are merely the prompt. And we'll spend 7 minutes on that one problem.
I think what throws the young advisor is when they actually hear what they want to hear. The advisor, meaning the client, potential client, says something like, "We're not really happy with our current advisor,
Mm-hmm.
and we're really looking to move and make a change."
Yeah,
And now what they do is they go, "Well, how long has that been a concern?" And they go, "Probably for the past 3 years," and that's it. They
that's
move
it.
on. And but because they expressed the prospect expressed that pain, the young advisor thinks they're done by just saying, "Well, how long has that been a concern?"
That's right.
And that's what you're talking about, not going deep enough.
And what I want that young advisor to do is I want them to explore why they were dissatisfied
Yeah.
with their existing advisor.
Yes.
What is it that they failed to do that you wish they had done?
Yes.
What is it that they did wish they hadn't done? And then why do those things matter? And all of a sudden now you have a much bigger picture of how this particular client wants to be serviced. In addition to that, by causing them to relive the frustrations that they've experienced with their existing advisor over the last 3 years, it brings that to life.
Mm-hmm.
And as Daniel Kahneman discovered, and he explores in his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, what makes people take action is something called the focusing illusion. And the more they talk about a specific problem in their mind, the bigger that problem becomes, to
Mm-hmm.
where at the end of talking about it, it's the number one priority. And so now they want to seek action to solve that problem. And now, the minute they leave us, of course, something else could take priority. So that's why we want to shorten the selling cycle as much as we can. So once we've found pain, once we've built it into a bonfire that's going to burn down their retirement if left unchecked, we need to get them to act on it. But the reality is that we need the prospect to explain to us the implications, the ramifications of what those concerns are causing them to think and how they feel about it.
Now, I don't know if you see this with all of the advisors that you've trained over the years, and you've trained hundreds of advisors over the years, but do you think it's because uh, the prospect that I see the advisor have the most challenge with is the prospect that tells the advisor everything they want to hear? For example, we really don't want to take risk anymore. We're scared of risk. We don't want to lose money. We don't have enough income, and we want to really guarantee all that income. Saying everything you want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
I find sometimes that's the hardest prospect
Yeah.
for them to sell because they go, "Okay, this is a layup."
Yes.
And I've been guilty of that. I'll give you a good
Yes.
example: referrals, right? I get a referral from a client. Bob referred me to you.
Yeah.
Okay, what's Bob told? He told me you did this, this, this. Okay, great. And I don't do the process. I
Right.
skip it
Right.
because I'm thinking, well, Bob's a great client. He's a smart guy. I'm sure he's told him everything. And now I find myself skipping the process. And I think no matter how good you get in this game,
Yeah.
it's kind of like golf.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, sometimes you're just gonna hack a hole.
Yeah.
And you know, you got to forget about that hole and move on to the next mentally.
Well, let's talk about the referral. A good referral comes with that. A good referral, the person who's referring a prospect to me, I'm going to say, what makes you think I can help this person?
Yeah.
And I'm looking for them to tell me the list of the problems that I could potentially resolve. That's great to know. But when I meet with that prospective client, first of all, I'm not going to say, Bob told me all these things about you,
Yeah, right.
because that makes them uncomfortable.
Of course.
I've got to ask questions to draw them out because it matters more whether it comes out of their mouth. It's not so much what I know, it's what they say.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I want them to build upon that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's helpful sometimes, well, it's helpful all the time to know from the person referring me why they think that this person will make a good client. But I'll never take what Bob's told me and say, well, Bob told me you have this problem, this problem, this problem. I'll say, Bob didn't share that much about you. But typically, when I'm meeting with somebody like yourself, the problems I hear most often, and now I'm going to put the three problems that
Yeah.
Bob gave me,
Right.
but I have to couch it again in the
Yes.
third party story
Yes.
so that this person can raise their hand on their own.
Yes.
Because nobody wants to be told they have a problem,
Yeah.
even when they do.
And you know, you think you're doing the right thing by coming out and saying, you know, Bob shared with me that you're getting ready to retire, that you have a 401k that you've got to move. You're concerned about the market right now and that you're not going to have enough income. So
Right,
you're going to need something like an annuity.
right.
And Bob was sharing with me you really like that idea. Even though you know that,
Yeah,
what you're saying, and this is what you did teach me, what you're saying, and I really want you to pay attention to what he's going to share because this is so important about how to position this. What you share with me is exactly what you're saying, and that is you have to position it as if you don't know anything.
exactly. You have to draw it out from them.
You got to get them to say those things.
And the way we do it is to say, I don't know if you can relate to this, but typically speaking, when I meet with somebody like yourself, close to your age, during retirement, worked hard their whole lives, have been responsible in terms of setting aside a sum of money that they would have to retire on. The concerns I hear most frequently are A, B, and C. And A, B, and C are the things that Bob told you they had concerns about.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to make it safe for them to raise their hand and
Yeah.
say, yeah, I share those concerns.
Yes.
Now, just because they have that concern doesn't make that concern pain.
Yeah.
Now I have to go down the diagnostic drill. I say, so tell me more about that. Now, the reality is that, believe it or not, people like talking about themselves
Yeah.
and they like talking about their pain as long as you're a good listener.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
If we give them answers to their pain too soon, number one is we short circuit the whole focusing illusion and the whole diagnostic bonfire building process. But the other thing too is if we have answers too quickly, it's kind of dismissive. It's like, oh, those are no big deal. We can take care of that for you. Like, you know,
So what makes a good listener?
a good listener is somebody that's patient. A good listener is somebody that, uses a lot of softening statements. I understand. Wow. I can appreciate that. If I were in your shoes, I'd probably feel the same way. And then keeps asking more, keeps asking, tell me more about that. How long has it been a concern? What have you done about it? What are the ramifications of that? How does that make you feel? Has anybody been able to help you with this? I mean, if you think about it, it's almost like what a therapist does.
Mm-hmm.
It's what a therapist does. You
They
know,
don't solve your problem for you.
they don't solve they try and get you to talk about it. Now, eventually, a good therapist is
We'll
going to
give you some.
provide
Yes.
solutions.
Yeah.
Okay, but look at a typical therapy session. I went to one. After my
Myself
divorce.
too. Yes.
And we spent of the 50, 55 minutes in that first session, I probably talked for about 45 minutes of that. And he said, "Well, Larry," I said, "we need to wrap up here today. But before we do, let me share some things that I've heard from you and let me give you some ideas. I'm assuming you'd like some ideas before you leave today. Is that fair?"
Mm.
I said, "Yes." But, 45 minutes of me talking versus 10 minutes of them summarizing what I talked about and then providing some solutions. Brian, that's what you do when you tell your third party story at the end of the diagnosis step. And it does two things. First of all, it tells the prospect that they've been listened to. Wow,
Mm-hmm.
you get it. We talk about SVC: summarize, validate, gauge commitment.
Mm-hmm.
The C stands for commitment. We summarize their pain at the end of the diagnosis step. We validate that we haven't missed anything, which is really just a form of active listening. And it
Mm-hmm.
makes that prospect feel like, wow, you've really listened well. Yeah, you grasp what my concerns are. And then we gauge their commitment when he said, okay, so this may sound like a stupid question, but I really want to know, are these concerns you share with me compelling enough for you to want to make some changes? And basically, we're just making sure that before we move forward in the process, let's make sure that there's sufficient pain for them to want to make a change. Because if there isn't, there's no point moving forward.
Summarize and validate, you put to me one day, it's kind of like you're parroting back what they say.
Exactly.
Just be a parrot. Just say back what they said to you
Yep.
to let them know that you're heard. And that step, I have found, if you skip that step, you'll find that you'll sometimes have someone not make a decision
Yeah.
because they don't feel like they were heard.
It's a good
And
point.
I'll pick that out when I'm doing sales training internally in the office and I'm listening to their meeting. I go, you never validated anything that they said.
Yeah.
You got all this pain, you did a great job building the pain, but you never summarized it for them. You never let them know that they were heard. So now they're getting in the car, they're driving home, and they're saying, I'm not sure if that guy really gets us.
Right. And they're not sure that when it's time for you to make your recommendations, that those recommendations are tailored specifically
To
to
them,
them,
right.
as opposed to just your boilerplate canned presentation.
And this is why I will tell you that having a process or a playbook, as we're calling it, right, is so important because, again, you have to have a step by step process that you can go through in that conference room. Otherwise, you're lost. I mean, going back 15 years ago when I met Larry, I was lost. I literally called him from my truck. I reached back in the back of the truck and found his book, and I'm flipping through while I'm driving, trying to find his phone number. And I get a hold of him, and it was probably the easiest sale in the world because I had so much pain because I didn't know where I stood with anybody. And I got tired of that. And I don't care that I lose somebody if I'm doing the client builder system because I know that I'm giving myself the highest probability of actually making them a client because I'm following the best process out there. And this is why it's so important that you commit to a process, even if you have been doing a certain process for some time and you're finding that it's not working. You've got to make that commitment to change, or you're never going to get through and go to that next level like you want to. And this is what this podcast is all about. It's helping you sell more, make more money, shorten the selling cycle, but more importantly, quit doing free consulting, because that's what we find a lot of ourselves doing, is doing free consulting because we haven't taken the time to truly understand what they need. And we start selling before we even know anything about them. We start bringing out illustrations or software or whatever when you don't have the right or the permission to do that yet. And Larry, I can't thank you enough for another great episode. And listen, you're not going to want to miss the next episode. We've got some great things we're going to be talking about positioning the no when we come back with another episode of the Client Builder Playbook. Thanks, Larry.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay.